Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And today we're continuing our study of this thing in Buddhism called Abhidharma, which is essentially the science that is basic to understanding what we're doing on the entire Buddhist path. So it might be helpful in case you're sort of coming across Buddhism and interested in practicing it, because as much as Buddhism is understood in terms of something that's very sweet and nice and politically correct, and there's a sense that Buddhism and the Dalai Lama represents nonviolence and everything that's good and wholesome and so on, there's actually an incredibly profound and deep science in understanding the mind. And from the Buddhist perspective, which you could, and this is of course a point that I'm often making, Buddhism is equally scientific as what we call the natural sciences. It operates with verifying and verifiable, verifiable science that is based on observation. But it's different from the materialist science, which is about observing tangible phenomena. It's about observing what probably and arguably is the most important element of our entire reality and our entire understanding of reality, which is the mind. As much as we could argue that we have an objective science, this objective science is constructed by subjectivities. And so the key role of the observer, the key role of the mind, really has always, from the Buddha, has always been the mind. And without understanding the mind, we don't really have much of an understanding of reality. We will always have a relative understanding of reality, and that's absolutely true for all of us, that we each experience a relative reality. We each have our own little cosmos, and also we each perceive the same objects in our individual way. So likewise, also the sciences that we might think of as being completely free from subjective constructions, cultural constructions, and so on, even within the academy itself, we argue that science is very much a cultural construct. It's very much something that's constructed on the basis of our particular methodologies that are specific to our particular culture, our particular assumptions and premises. Somebody's saying they don't have sound. I think there is sound. Could somebody else verify that there is sound in their end? There is sound. Good. All right. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So that's where we need to take into consideration really the key vantage point from which we experience reality, and that is necessarily the mind. Once we understand the key role of the mind, then we also understand that the realities that we construct are constructed by the mind, and that's where we then begin to see the different experiences that we can have. We can have a more or less accurate understanding of reality. And the inspiration in the Buddhist teaching was really the Buddha's discovery of understanding with reality without the usual overlay of confusion, which is the basis for all suffering. And the Buddha really, when the Buddha taught, it was never ever from the point of view of presenting some mystical truth. It was really just based on the wish to alleviate the suffering everywhere. And what the Buddha saw is, as long as we operate from a delusional subjectivity, as long as our mind doesn't know itself, as long as our mind is still caught up in some, you could say, cognitive confusion, some afflictive emotional confusion, there's never going to be really any freedom, and there's going to be a corresponding suffering. So the Buddha's entire teaching was really based on a science of understanding where does this confusion take place and what can we do to alleviate this suffering. So what we have in the Buddhist path is really an applied science. We first of all have what we can call the view, which is an understanding of reality based on observation, not based on cultural beliefs or revelation or anything mystical, but essentially based on empirical observation. We can see how our mind operates, and we can see what are the conditions that create an afflicted or afflicted mind. And that's where the Buddha, in his teaching on the Four Noble Truths, he first of all established the condition of suffering, which is basic to every subjectivity that essentially experiences time and space. And this is what we refer to as samsara, in which there is a continual cycle of suffering. And the Buddha identified that this suffering is not imposed by some exterior agency, and it's also not something that just happens randomly, like you're supposed to suffer in this universe. But the Buddha identified that it's due to this confusion, this fundamental delusion that we suffer. And the Buddha also saw that the basic ground, our basic disposition, our basic nature is not afflicted. Our basic nature is untarnished by confusion. And so the Buddha's enlightenment was the discovery of this absence of confusion. And yet the Buddha also saw this was something that was basic to all beings. This was something he saw he had in common with every sentient being. And on the basis of that, the Buddha then taught a path which was about healing or dismantling confusion. You could say the Buddha's entire path is therapy. The Buddha's vision of all life is a basic condition of complete clarity, and that in no way is caught up in the ordinary confusion that we operate with. And the entire Buddhist path is aimed at dismantling this confusion. So basic to the entire path is an understanding of the most quintessential confusion that we possess, which is the belief in a self, the belief in an I. And it's not that difficult for us to identify how we ourselves, and also we can observe it in others, we suffer the more we are tightly addicted to or wound up in self-centering, selfishness. And for those who are interested, I'm always happy to share a paper by Matthew Ricard and a French academic called Michael Dambrun, who identified using contemporary research within the fields of phenomenology, wellness, mindfulness, and so on, drawing on contemporary research, identified the difference between the degrees of well-being and happiness between those who operate from the point of view of self-centering and those who operate from the point of view of selflessness. Basically, those that operate from the point of view of I'm the most important person in the universe, and those that operate very much from a panoramic perspective that engages the environment and the other. So if you're curious about that, then this paper I'm always happy to share, and we have studied it in the past, but it's something that I think for a lot of us is quite helpful because it draws on contemporary research, familiar language within psychology and so forth, where of course as soon as you come across the Buddhist teaching, you're thrown into the deep end with a lot of Buddhist vocab. At the same time, my role here is obviously to make that particular vocab more transparent and immediate. But the basic delusion and the basic problem, you could say, that the Buddha wished to address was this fundamental cognitive dysfunction where we operate from a vantage point of clinging to a self. Now, within Western phenomenology and Western science, this self is seen as being solid. There's not even question. There's an assumption that we all have a self. There's not really any kind of notion that there's no self. And you could say, from again going back to a relative experience that we all have, yes, we definitely all experience a self. But at the same time, and what Abhidharma is going to be showing us is that this self really is a construct. And even within social studies, we talk about social constructivism and constructionism as the insight that actually we are different people depending on who we're with. So as such, the sort of notion that we are a sort of unitary, monolithic, ever unchanging person is completely, you could say, flies in the face of our everyday experience, that we are different people depending on who we're with. And not only that, we change all the time. So of course we label ourselves in a particular way, but the reality is that we are so many different things. And so it's this kind of insight into the constructed nature of our being, our psychology, and also our, you could say, the physical aspect of our person, that enables us to see that this fixation on self is actually not warranted and actually not founded on any logic or any reality. And this also goes for the phenomenal world around us. We label the phenomenal world as a solid reality, but again, we all see this reality, this particular room, this particular world, and so forth in different ways. And so Abhidharma also analyzes the phenomenal world. And what we do once we begin to analyze is that we begin to dismantle some assumptions around the world as existing in a particular way. The problem is, you could say, this might sound very theoretical, but the problem really is that on the basis of our labels, we begin to have really strong likes and dislikes that, if we look closer, actually aren't justified. We might have a strong like or dislike for a particular person. Once we begin to know people better, we understand they're much more complex than we initially think. And so the more we go into any given reality, the more we see complexity, the more our simple-minded judgment begins to evaporate. And so you could say the entire Buddhist project of Vipassana is really just beginning to see this complexity and beginning to dismantle these sort of hard opinions and these hard reactive patterns that essentially are basic to driving our sense of self, and also the way that we label other, and the suffering that comes from that. In his work here, Steven Goodman, who, well, just to say, Steven Goodman was someone who studied Buddhism for a large part of his life. I think probably most of his life, and he ended up studying at the California Institute of Integrative Studies, CIIS. Are you familiar with that, Peter? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is based inside the city, right?
Yeah, it's pretty.
It's not in Berkeley. Yeah. Okay.
California.
All right. So, anyways, Steven was teaching there, and he was a tremendously nice person, and also somebody who had a gift for communicating. So, throughout his many years of teaching Buddhist studies, he taught on Abhidharma quite a bit. And so, before he passed away, which was only recently, he wrote this book called The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening, which is then what we're presently studying. I apologize to you guys here in the room, because I actually had intended, but I haven't gotten it together yet, to have a screen here. I think even with the light that we have, it should be possible. So then I can project the text up on a screen. So we'll try to get that together next time. You can just imagine. Anyway, I'll be reading from the text, so you won't be left out. But it's always nice to have the text to refer to. So yeah, we'll get it together. Where did the text go? Here we are. Yeah. Now we're going to be looking at something that is basic to this, you could say, deconstruction that we operate with in Buddhism, which is the study of what's called the skandhas, the ayatanas, and the dhatus. And these are essentially ways with which we operate with the notion of self, what we in Buddhism call the 5 skandhas, is really the basic components of, or it's the Buddhist way of understanding how we exist, our, you could say, physical and mental aggregation. So we could say anytime that we begin to look at our person, then the ordinary assumptions that I'm a solid entity falls away. Now, I'd like to right away say we have to distinguish between what we call conventional truth and absolute truth. Absolute truth is what's going to set us free. So the degree to which we understand absolute truth will be all the freer. But for the time being, we have to acknowledge we have what's called relative truth, which is, or the conventional truth, which is what we operate from. So we definitely operate from a sense that I have a body, I have a mind, and we would say that's a given. Nobody's denying that we have body and mind. But this is where you could say the sages and us ordinary persons, we differ a bit, because the sages and even the old Stoics and so forth, they would understand that we have a body, but they wouldn't be attached to it. So it's the absolute truth is what will enable us to not be caught up in our ordinary experience. And this is what enables us to begin to see beyond ourselves. That's where we begin to also have empathy, compassion, because we begin to sort of have a wider perspective that doesn't just center on ourselves. It also means less attachment to our body, less attachment to our states of mind and so forth, and a much more freer and more fluid interaction with the world around us. And so the point of deconstructing our body and our mind is really to enable us to have a wider perspective with regards to this so-called solid sense of self. What we also operate with in Abhidharma is then what we call the ayatanas, which is essentially the senses and their objects. So whenever we are engaged in a particular perception, whether it be we see something, we operate with a consciousness that's seeing it, that is linked up with, let's say, the eye. If I'm looking at an object, I'm going to be looking out through my eyes at a particular object, and there's a consciousness that develops on the basis of that. So we usually talk about subject and object, the one that sees and the object that's seen. What we begin to understand as we investigate this is that the so-called object is so colored by the subject that observes. And very often we make the mistake of assuming that our version of what we're seeing is shared by everyone. We have this obviously when we're tasting some food, some people will say, this tastes fantastic, and others will say, no, thank you. Or we listen to music. And so these objects that we perceive, they're so colored by the individual perceiver. And the more we understand that, the more we're actually able to understand how others experience reality. We also sometimes expand this basic, you could say, identification of subject and object in terms of then, like I was saying, we have the organ, which is, for example, with the eye. Then there's the object of the organ, and then there's the consciousness that develops. So of course, we ordinarily have an eye, and that in itself is the organ, but there's a consciousness that exists within our mind. And that's where we have these three dimensions, really, which is the subject, the object, but then also the consciousness that develops on the basis of that. So we talk about these five senses that we have, and then also we talk about the sixth sense, which is essentially just the mental consciousness. So all of these, they add up to what we sometimes talk about as the 12 ayatanas or the 18 dhatus. We're basically talking about 6 different channels or sixfold processing. So with the understanding of the constructed nature of our experience, we begin to be less caught up in this assumption about a solid reality. So I'm here attempting to a little bit sum up for some of you who haven't participated in the previous classes what we've already covered. I don't know if I can do this every time, but anyway, since this is still somewhat the beginning of the year, then I'm always trying to do my best. But anyway, I think we'll continue with the text at this point. So we've talked about how we experience on the basis of our sense of self. We experience a particular world, and on the basis of our experience of the world, then we interact continually, but unfortunately on the basis of our afflicted sense of self and the way that we project the world. And in the Buddhist teaching, and I should say this again, repeat this for those who have heard this many times, but also for all the persons that are new, and what's basic really to the Buddhist science is that in Buddhism, we attribute primacy to mind. And that's the big divide between, you say, Buddhist science and materialist science, or what we call modern science. Buddhist science operates with that it's the mind that is really the creator of all our experience. And the materialist science, they basically, their domain is understanding the material. And so they do this very accurately and beautifully and effectively. And thanks to that, we have computers, we have modern medicine, and we have incredible fields of knowledge around the material. But the mind and consciousness is not the domain of materialist science. And by its own admission, consciousness within neuroscience and modern science is what we call the hard problem of science. It's not understood. Buddhism hasn't made tremendous sort of advances in terms of technology. I sometimes joke that the epitome of Tibetan technology is perhaps the butter tea churner, but you know, there's not really any kind of advanced technology that would sort of blow your mind in Tibetan, or for that matter, any of the traditional Buddhist societies. But we have to give it, and that's where Western, you could say, colonialist arrogance sometimes gets in the way. We have to acknowledge that consciousness is something that's understood in these cultures, and we certainly could very well learn a lot from these. And it's on the basis of this understanding of consciousness, then, that the Buddhists would assert that this really has primacy over matter. So, so we really see the world in the Buddhist context. We don't see it as a solid world out there, even though it appears as such. And of course, we all conventionally experience that. But we would say, if we begin to analyze, we would say this world that we experience is a construct of our particular perception, our particular subjective perception. And that's where the so-called world that we experience out there is very much our world. It doesn't make it less real as such. And the Dalai Lama gets on an airplane, and ordinary people get on an airplane, and they're all in the same airplane. It's not like it's a whole different, you could say, reality as such. But the Dalai Lama's insight into the nature of this phenomenal world is what makes a huge difference in terms of understanding this reality. And this is what we're looking at here. This also means that what we think of as and what we come across in Buddhist teaching very often, we think, oh, that's what the Buddhists believe. It's not really what the Buddhists believe, but it's more that this is what they assert on the basis of this particular science. So in Buddhism, we would find that Buddhists accept that mind is not being something that's physical. It doesn't disappear at the time of death, and so we talk about re-embodiment, and so we talk about rebirth in Buddhism, but it's not something that's based on sort of cultural or Tibetan or Thai belief systems. It simply does understanding that mind having primacy, it re-embodies itself. It recreates universes and worlds. And it's on the basis of eliminating confusion altogether that individuals are free. And that's where we talk about enlightenment, also something that's entirely an unknown within our particular culture and even within our particular sciences of psychology and phenomenology and so on in the Western context. The idea of subjectivity completely free of any confusion is entirely unheard of. So the idea of Buddha and the sacred, or the notion of deity and the notion of something that is uncontaminated by confusion, is something in our culture is entirely absent. And so when we're engaging in the Buddhist teaching, then we're very much interested in identifying how confusion comes about, and we understand it's on the basis of this confusion that we create our particular worlds. And so Abhidharma then is where we begin to analyze where this delusion takes place. So up until here, then, Steven was recently explaining how we create our different worlds on the basis of essentially fixating. We all operate with a particular experience of self and a particular sense of projecting onto the world. And this Steven was referring to as fixity. And then so on the basis of fixating on our particular experience that we begin to have this these various perceptions that we call samsara. So, I hope this all makes sense. I'm a little bit sort of overly concerned every time to get everybody with, and so I always end up using half an hour, which is pretty much half an hour, without getting into the text. But I always like to make sure that everybody has sort of gotten what we're talking about, and very often it seems to be that even some of those who have attended classes earlier, they appreciate some of these summaries. Yeah, someone's saying, I wonder if each week it's a requirement for us to read the section required for class, just like we do in the online courses, so you don't feel the stress to recap on the previous classes so much. Just a suggestion. Thank you, sweetheart. That is so true. Yeah, we might have to do that. Yeah, I think all of you, if you're going to attend these classes, I think you're going to have to, everybody's welcome here, but I think, yes, you will have to study beforehand. Otherwise, we will have this scenario each time. Because essentially, I'm trying to essentially recap the whole of Buddhism for everybody each time. And it is rather overly ambitious, a project that probably is doomed to fail. But anyway, so yes, I'll do that, and maybe what I'll do is I'll develop some way of doing this so you all know. So this book here, please, if you don't have it in the hard copy, get the Kindle version, and this will be basic really for the class. Yeah. Good. Okay, so we've talked about how the various realms of samsara are constructed on the basis of this fixity, on the basis of these so-called 6 channels, the 5 senses, and also the mind. So what Steven now is going to be going through is what he says, exercise in 6-fold processing. And that is how we essentially create this sense of a solid world on the basis of these 6 channels, or these 6, what is it, Aldous Huxley, he had a book he wrote, Doors of Perception, yeah. So to understand all this, he says, we have to use our capacity to make distinctions. We have to use the Dharma known as prajna, or wisdom. Now, prajna is key really in the Buddhist path, because prajna is essentially what we develop. It's wisdom, but not in the sense of accumulating knowledge particularly, even though that is part of the process, but it's insight. And it's really insight that sees through deception. So we classically would talk about how, for example, at dusk, we might see something in the path that we think is a snake, but if we analyze, we see it's just a rope. And that insight is prajna. What is not prajna is the belief that we think, oh, there's a snake there. And then we look, and then we see that there is no snake, it's just a rope. And that prajna is, you could say, intelligence, it's being awake, and it's not something that necessarily has anything to do with bookish knowledge or accumulation of experience, but it is wisdom, it's intelligence, sharpness that is, and we, for example, in the example of in the image of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, we have Manjushri sitting with a sword, and that is the sword of prajna. That is what cuts through this web of confusion. So this is something that is innate to us. We all possess naturally prajna. It can be more or less, you could say, developed, but it's something that's innate to all of us. So that's why we very often, if somebody is sort of confused, we'll say, hey, see? That's what we say. We just say, see? And then they go, oh, yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to give them a long lecture. We're just asking them to have a look. So that sort of clarity that sees through confusion doesn't mean that we gain a new knowledge or a new set of data, but it really just means that we look. It's intelligence in action. So he says, to make distinctions, we're developing this quality of prajna, or wisdom. He says, see if you can experience this sixfold way of processing. See if you can develop a bit of Abhidharma habit. If you're hearing something, notice you're hearing something. For example, in here, we can hear the aircon that's running. We can hear, sometimes we can hear cicadas from outside. You can hear there's somebody sitting talking, and so on. He says, see if you can note the difference between concretely looking at something, as the Vietnamese master Thich Nhat Hanh says, really entering into the dimension of the concrete, sensual presence of the color and the shape, or remembering something. Because I might say red, and we all have a sort of generic image of red, or shoe, or lake, and this comes up, but it's not actually part of our immediate sensory perception. And that's where we can ground ourselves in the actual sensual presence of what is within our field of sensory perception presently. So sometimes we blur the two. We sort of are sort of lost within our own thinking, and we're not really relating or connecting to the immediate sensory. So Steven says we have the habit of blurring the two. We often have one moment of concrete visual contact that is followed by 20 or 30 moments in which we're spacing out before we're coming back to what we see. You know, when we observe things, and this is also something we talk about in Western epistemology, which we see things, but then we have our own version of seeing things. We're not actually directly touching the object. We're seeing our particular version. We might look at the floor, and when I look at the floor, I think, wow, what a stroke of genius of Michela and Steven to paint the floor this color. It's just perfect. And others might have a different version of it. They might look at the color and think something else. And in fact, the initial moment is really just the naked observing of the object, but then comes all these sort of like layers of interpretations and second thoughts. And that's where what we're doing with the Abhidharma is begin to become aware that what's actually happening in terms of our perception. It's very much grounding ourselves. Of course, you might say this is very theoretical, but it's essentially dismantling what gets in the way of our ordinary grounding. So Steven says, an Abhidharmika, meaning somebody who studies and practices the Abhidharma, an Abhidharmika becomes adept in noting these distinctions, meaning being aware and discerning between the object itself and the layers of interpretation that we add to it. He says, see if you can actually experience a difference. According to the Abhidharma, this helps to cut through the fixity of our obsessional patterns. So when we're seeing something, there's one thing is to see it, but then there's the whole layer of interpretations that actually begins to solidify things in a particular way. So I might show you a picture of the former president of the USA, and one thing is to just see a face of a human. But then comes all the layers, all the stuff, all the kind of regurgitation of our particular sort of narrative around this particular person. So this is where we then now are entering into this domain then that is called elemental analysis, where we're going to be looking at these particular aspects and deconstructing the various aspects of the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas. May I know the title of the paper you mentioned from a French scholar? Look, what I'll do is, okay, let me just find it here for you. What I'll do is I'll upload it, and it might already be up there. Let's just say. Yeah. Okay, it's called self-centeredness and selflessness. Okay, and I'll upload it. I'll just bring it up here on the screen. But it's something that I think already is sitting in the resource folder. It has a rather long name, but that's basically the gist of it. It's really interesting, and somewhere in the earlier recordings we did about, I think we spent about a couple of months actually studying this. Okay, dhatus and channel processing. Okay, so the heading is the Abbey Way. Steven was from California, so you'll forgive him for his very, how to say, hip language. The Abbey Way. We're going to go the Abbey Way. He says, in the Abhidharma analysis, which is just a systematic analytical way of presenting the basic teachings of the Buddha that are contained in the sutras, there is a well-known set of 3 schemata for presenting the teachings. The 5 aggregates, skandhas, the 12 sense bases, ayatanas, and the 18 elements, dhatus. Of course, people who practice Vajrayana and all these kind of sadhanas that people are doing, Vimaladrup and Chime Palma Nyingthig and what have you, all of these actually operate, the whole notion of deity, all operates with understanding the purity of these skandhas, ayatanas, and dhatus. So there's never ever a sense that in the Vajrayana we don't have anything to do with these. In fact, these are basic to our entire engagement with the notion of deity and mandala. And also what we refer to as the peaceful and wrathful deities. Sometimes we have this whole science around the. Please have a. There's a whole science around our perceptions, which is in the Vajrayana context is presented in terms of the innate purity of all our perceptions. And this is the teaching that's known as the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. And that's where tragically people end up thinking, oh, this is some sort of Tibetan thing that you have all these deities. But it has absolutely nothing to do with deities. It's just understanding the subjective experience that's involved when we perceive the skandhas, the ayatanas, and the dhatus. And we really just refer to these in terms of deities from the point of view of how we experience it. So when we talk about all the deities and the mandalas and the sort of various teachings, such as the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities in the Vajrayana, we're in fact just coming back to the same old study around the skandhas, the ayatanas, and the dhatus. So it says in the Abhidharma Kosha Bhasha, which is then, I'll just see what the note says. So this is, this is chapter 1. Okay, thank you, good to know. But this is essentially Vasubandhu's commentary on the Abhidharma. So it says that these schemata, they're taught in order to counteract particular wrong views regarding the status of the self. These are taught in accord with the individual's capacity to understand and what the individual desires by way of length of teaching. And that's why we would say the skandhas is a shorter way of explaining it, the ayatana is slightly longer, and to remind ourselves, the Abhidharma is a way of inquiring into the Buddha Dharma in an Abbey way. And Abbey here means in order to manifest. So in Tibetan, the Tibetan word is ngurpa, which again also means to have something manifest. Ngurnsum du nangwa, meaning something that becomes manifest in its appearance. So this is ultimately about how to directly manifest and fully make evident through such study a direct perception of this famous reality. So this is for us to actually understand what is our world made up of, what is our being made out of, what is it actually that we're continually experiencing. And this is, again, not anything abstract. It's what we experience every single micro moment of our existence. So again, it's not about making an inquiry into some sort of interesting esoteric science about something alternative or otherworldly, but it's very much about analyzing the very foundations of what drives our particular being, and particularly what drives this deluded assumption that fixates on a self, and which really is what trips us up in terms of our relationship with ourselves and our world. So it is said that Abhi in Abhidharma is Abhimukya, to make manifest the actual state of how things are. And this is done by learning about the skandhas, ayatanas, and dhatus in their particularity. So I'm glad Steven is also doing a bit of recap here. So we're all very eager to get everybody sort of on the same page. So thank you. Here somebody has the title of this paper by Matthew Ricard and Michael Dambois. So it's Self-Centeredness and Selflessness, a theory of self-based psychological functioning and its consequence for happiness. And it is in the reading material folder in the Dropbox. So you already have it there. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, counteracting specific errors through dhatu analysis. So the dhatus, and again, I'll just recap the dhatus. They are the 5 senses that we have, but we also include thought as one of our senses. We all can hear something, right? And if somebody says, what are you hearing? I can say, well, I'm hearing the aircon, I'm hearing my own voice, you know, etc. What do I see? Well, I see this, the wall, and so on. I know what I'm seeing. And if somebody asks me, what are you thinking about? I know what I'm thinking about too. That is also an object of cognition. So in this way, the 6th sense in the Buddhist context doesn't mean some sort of, supernatural understanding or sort of something clairvoyant of any kind. It simply just includes the mind as a faculty and a set of objects. And so we have, in that sense, we have then the five senses. We have the objects of these perceptions, such as form, sound, etc. And then we have the particular perception. So one is I have my particular eye that sees an object out there, but there's also the visual perception that takes place. So I have my eyes and I have the object and so on, but the perception itself, that also is something unto itself. And for example, at night, we have visual perceptions, even though there are no particular objects. It's entirely generated by the mind. So perception stands on itself as the third. So Stephen, he refers to these 3 in terms of the capacity, meaning the organ, the field, meaning the object, and then what he called the integrational function, which is then the various kinds of perception that we have. So these together, these 3, you could say, areas that are related to our 6 senses, they all add up to what we then call the 18 dhatus. So the dhatus are taught specifically to counteract the error with respect to a false self, a crippling sense of fixity that we understand to be the root cause of continual suffering. All these categories and schemes are a way of directly cutting through the root cause of suffering, and one of them is the fixity called the self. We spent quite some time already on why this is not such a good translation. In the context of Abhidharma, this fixity is defined very carefully as any habit of perception or reflection which we hope or fear to be permanent, unique, or independent. So this is again something which cannot be influenced. But what he's talking about here is that we fixate on things thinking that they actually exist in their own particular way. For example, if I say hand, we might say, well, there's a solid hand there. But no, actually, if I'm sort of having a like or a dislike with regards to a particular object, I actually don't see that it's made up, that it's a construct, but I immediately relate to it as just a solid, unique phenomenon that's sort of there, annoyingly, you could say, enduring, permanent, fixed, and I fail to see its constructed nature. And that's where analysis, what enables us to, for example, look at an object like the hand and say, well, it's made up of tissues and sinews and flesh and blood and so on. And there's different parts of it. There's fingers, there's the palm, there's different areas that together we refer to this whole thing as a unit, but it is in fact just a construct. And any given phenomenon is like that. Your homework, if you like, is to try and analyze whether any phenomenon that we sort of fixate on or we perceive, whether it actually has some enduring essence. And we'll see that every phenomenon is a construct. And that's where we would see our engagement with objects is very much colored by a delusion that fixates on the surface or fixate on particular aspects. And on the basis of that, we have the whole, you can say, misery of beginning to have this very narrow relationship to our reality, where we're always essentially imposing censorship upon the basis of what we like and dislike. And so this is where we would say we're much better off in our reality if we're able to actually relate fully to things, understanding them in their entirety, in their complexity, in their fullness, rather than retreat into our narrow construction. So this is where this fixity is a problem, and the analysis is the solution. So Steven goes on to say, the error with respect to the existence of a self or a fixity that the study of the 18 dhatus counteracts is the error of being confused about the difference, meaning not knowing precisely at the level of experience the difference between moments of seeing, hearing, smelling, and touching on the one hand, meaning all the channels of our senses, and the moments that are not seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching on the other, which is then the mental, channel 6. This confusion is summarized as being confused about form and mind. In Sanskrit, this refers to rupa and chitta respectively. Forms here means anything that we can contact. Forms refer to things out there that we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Channels 1 to 5, meaning the 5 senses. And then there is the 6th channel, mind, better translated as other, meaning everything else that anyone could ever experience, including moments of inspiration and moments of despair. It is said that this mode of analysis is put forth in order to experientially have a sense of the difference between the sensory modes and the non-sensory mode, channel 6. So this is essentially what we covered before in terms of understanding that on one hand, we have the actual experience, but then we also have this abstract way that we perceive things in terms of just the way that we psychologically label things in a particular way. Someone is asking, are the dhatus and ayatanas interchangeable? Well, we'll see. There's an overlap between them. Yeah. So then in terms of these dhatus, then there are 18 elements. And these are then what we've already talked about in terms of these 6 senses and how they operate with their objects and how they result in their perceptions. So these are then these 6 in terms of the particular faculty, the particular object, and the particular perception. So this is 6 times 3. So we have these 18. And so those of you who are following online will see this particular chart that's in the book here. You'll see that. So he says, the 18 dhatus are listed in the following table according to how Vasubandhu explains them. The 18 dhatus are divided in 3 columns, namely capacity, which is then the particular organ. Then there's the field or the object, which is what the organ then perceives. And then the integrational function, which is essentially the perception that we then have. So we're going to go through just these first, the particular senses. So the first column, the capacity, consists of dhatus 1 to 6. So these are then eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. The Sanskrit term for capacity, essentially the senses, is indriya. and in Tibetan is Wangpo. The term Indriya, and I apologize if I hope I'm pronouncing the Sanskrit okay. Huh? Okay, good. Is a favorite word in the Abhidharma and was given its own chapter in the Abhidharma Kosha. And in that chapter, they tell us there are 22 such capacities, such as the capacity and manifestation of being a biological man or woman. Here, in this context of the 6 capacities, however, Indriya refers to the capacity to process information, and the dhatus in this column are as follows. So essentially going through these, and really just it means you could say the faculties. And with the faculties, then we also include the mind. So the first, eye, as in the eye that sees. The text makes it very clear that eye here in the Abhidharma is used as an indriya, as a capacity to process visual information. It does not just mean the physical eye that can be dissected. If there is a defect of the eye, indriya, even though there may be forms that could be processed, the processing will not occur. So it's the intact eye. So ear, when we speak of ear as the capacity to process sound, we're not talking about the part that you can pull apart when somebody is not behaving. Okay, this must be okay. When somebody is not behaving like you want them to, we're not even speaking about the part inside, the part that we normally associate with hearing in the West. That is the physiological aspect. Rather, we are talking about the ear's intact functioning capacity in a living being. So this is then, you could say, essentially the capacity for, in the case of the eye, for seeing, and in the case of the ear, for hearing. So it's more than just the physiological aspect. It is this intact quality of the faculty.
Will hearing in this context, like more than the physiological, you said, right? And can it be as listening or it's...
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's listening. What really it just refers to is this, that we have, as a sentient being, we have the capacity to see and hear. So for example, also in a dream, we're actually not using the physical eye, but we're still seeing, right? And we're still hearing and so on. So yes. I'll just go through through the last 4. Nose, this is again the capacity to process smells. Again, the faculty. And the tongue, this is the capacity to process taste. Body, this is the capacity to process tactile sensations, but also the capacity to experience rumbling in the stomach, movements in a bit more interior way. So it's both in terms of what we're experiencing outside, but also interior. Do we call this sparsha? Sparsha, yeah. Touch, huh? Yeah. Rekpa in Tibetan, yeah. And then mind. Vasubandhu said this is different from the other 5. The difference is that we can locate the site of functional processing for the first 5. There is no localized site for the functional processing of something called mind. So this is, of course, where Steven then refers to this thing that we call other. So basically, we have the 5 senses, and then we have that which is, of course, enormous in terms of its impact, but which is then what we refer to as the 6th, which is then the mind. So actually, like someone was suggesting here earlier, then I would say, please, this is really, really valuable material. So see if you can get the book, or if you don't, get the Kindle version onto your your device, because then we'll actually be able to make a little bit of sort of headway in terms of the actual study here.
And the brain is not considered as a faculty or mind.
What's that?
The brain is not considered the faculty.
No, that's now the question is, the brain is not considered the faculty of the mind. No, not at all. But it's a bit like here, where we would, like Steven was saying, in terms of when we're talking about the ear, that we're talking about the faculty to be able to hear. But it's more than just the actual thing that like he would have been a good professor. He seems to be subscribing to the pedagogy of pulling people's ears. So there you go. Anyway, so it's more than just the physical. And of course, within the Buddhist context, we would say that brain is constructed just like everything else is constructed by the mind. So we would never say that, for example, mind is something that's created by the brain. But of course, we would say that there's a lot of correlation. And so just like in neuroscience, we say there's neural correlation between, you could say, conscious experience and the functioning of the brain. But of course, but we would debate which came first there. And that's why we would say mind is what constructs the brain. Mind is what constructs the world, what constructs the physical. And so there's a little bit difference there. But of course, we equally in Buddhism would attribute brain as being key in terms of the functioning of our sensory and, you say, psychological processing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. Just curious, how in this process of, I guess, different people coming up with this way of seeing the world, how do they counter misinformation? Like, how is there a process through which, I guess, in the Abhidharma or in Buddhism in general, like differences of opinion are able to be said, well, that might be the way you see it, but that's not the way it is. Or is it just accepted that everyone has different subjective experiences or intersubjective experiences? Some people are more subjective than others. Like, how does is there a way there's just a I'm just curious because this current time where there's a lot of misinformation. I'm curious what that.
You mean fake news?
No, I mean genuine misinformation. Yeah, like this where there's a way where people say that's a little bit on the forest what you're talking about, and this is the way we've collectively agreed that this is how things are.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you would agree that that's all very relative. And what is misinformation? So the question is, how about misinformation? How do we refer to as that? Within what we call relative conventional truth, we talk about what we call pure relative truth, which is accurate science, so to speak. So for example, if I were to say this is vodka, then you might say, well, that could be vodka, but I don't believe that. And then you come over and you taste it, and it's actually water. But you see, somebody might sit out there saying, he's sitting up there drinking vodka,
It's happened with Keith Richards. He actually drank iced tea. Everyone thought he was a whiskey head.
Yeah.
Someone tasted it and he's.
I know, and people say terrible things about Keith Richards. He's never touched any of that stuff. Anyway, so is Jakob drinking pure absolute here, or is he just sitting drinking water? Well, there's misinformation and there's actual truth, right? That's what you would say, right? So that's why we can go up and verify. So we would distinguish between what we call pure relative truth and flawed relative truth.
Okay.
So you're sitting there whispering that Jakob's drinking vodka, to Bahita, and then this sort of goes around. The guy's sitting there getting completely, plastered. That is misinformation, but it's also what we would call false or flawed relative truth, deceptive relative truth. And then there's pure relative truth, which is saying this is water, but it's still just all a construct.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's where we would say in the absolute, these labels such as water and so forth are entirely constructed. Within the scriptures, we would even go as far as saying the gods, they would see this as pure amrita, pure nectar. And for those in the hell realms, they would see this as fire. And, some fish and animals, they would see this as a place to live. So in this way, we would say there's all these different relative perceptions. But there is also what we would call, within the relative, there's what you could call pure relative and the flawed relative. Yeah. Does this book or on Abhidharma go into the complexities of how we experience phenomena when awake versus asleep? Because someone can be literally brain dead and come back to life, yet still experience phenomena as completely real or felt. Well, yes. I mean, no, it doesn't go into the particulars, but we're going to be looking at how phenomena generally experience across the various categories. And that's where we also would take into account experiences that persons would have in different states. So yes, that would include sleep, and even you could say what we experience after we you could say clinically dead. The text mentions no localized site for mind. How about the whole body? Mind and body interrelated. Mind can exist without body. Can you ask that next time? Because this actually would require a little bit reading exactly what Steven has said here, and I actually need to be a little bit more sure on what he possibly could mean. But could you email me this question, and so I just have it so I can be prepared for that next time? Yeah. So, but the bottom line here really is that the mind is something that then interprets the object, and that's where the mind sort of goes beyond just something that's, you could say, grounded in something that's localized. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
So the sixth consciousness is more about thinking. That's what you mean with
mind,
right? It's
yes.
not really mind, because mind participates in all the other five too.
Yes.
So
yeah.
it's more the thought.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. For the schema and for the simplicity, we would refer to it as the sixth sense in that sense. But of course, what is the point that's being made here is that mind has so much more function beyond just the ordinary, just purely thought. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for hanging in there. So let me just make a bookmark here. Next time we'll begin without any recap. We won't. So we'll dedicate. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish evermore and more. Thank you. So we'll just take a 2-minute break, and then I'll say something about meditation, and then we'll do some meditation. It's funny, this webcam that I'm using, it normally works, but I don't know. Up here, for some reason, today and last time, it's been having this issue of being blurry. I don't know why. Anyway, so be it. Just a few words about Buddhist meditation, and actually very much an extension of what we were talking about earlier in terms of grounding our experience and not actually being properly connected to reality. The very purpose of Buddhist meditation is actually facilitating the most obvious thing you'd think that there could ever be, but which is not that obvious after all, which is us actually being present within our reality, because we're not. We're very much caught up in our version of reality. And so on the basis of our version of reality, we have all these strong labels that we impose on phenomena. And this is what drives these afflicted relationships to the phenomenal world. And essentially, what the Buddhist path is about is dismantling this. So we would say the sage is someone who's free from these projections onto reality, and as such opens up to a much greater expanse of reality. And us ordinary persons that are still caught in this confusion, mind-made confusion, we just don't experience reality, and we experience a sort of diminished version of reality. So the sage is not someone that enters into a great alternative cosmic reality or something otherworldly. The sage is someone who engages into this world, and we're the ones that are sort of lost in our version of this world. So that's where we simply are, with the practice of the path, we're trying to sort of emerge from our own private Idaho and actually be able to engage with the actual reality. But it's on the basis of this reality that we then talk about enlightenment, that we talk about a greater perspective, vipassana, and so on. The very key to this is then the practice of meditation. And meditation here is not understood then as something about retreating from the world, but is about something that grounds us in the world. And this actual exercise of being not distracted is associated with the practice of sitting. But of course, what we really are about is what goes beyond just the sitting and relating to our entire reality. And that is then the scope of what we call vipassana. So vipassana is essentially wisdom. Vipassana is when we are not clouded in our experience. So vipassana here again, this is me going off recapping, but vipassana is not just some technique. Vipassana indeed sometimes is understood as a technique, but it is in fact much more than that. It really means wider perspective, and it is the scope of what we do with all of Buddhist practice. But the method for us having this more connected relationship to our reality goes through the discipline of actually sitting and being quiet. Some people might object, saying this is terribly boring, and we'd rather have some spirituality where we're imagining things or sort of have something that puts us into a good state of mind, and that's completely fine. But it a little bit comes from a rather poverty-stricken place that we actually need to embellish on our reality. And the hardcore practice of meditation in the Buddhist context is that reality is actually perfect. And we're actually missing out by wanting to always fill it up with all sorts of entertainment. And that's where meditation could equally become distracting. So the paradox, of course, is that in Buddhism, we have something called Vajrayana Buddhism, with all sorts of sadhanas and all sorts of rituals. And sadly, they end up becoming distractions in themselves. So that's where we could say that the Vajrayana could very much end up just becoming an incredible distraction, an incredible sort of just entertainment. And we could end up having all sorts of obsessions around rituals and all this sort of the troubles that come with rituals and so on. Then you have a whole universe of people. Are we doing the rituals correctly? And are we and and then and what should I do the ritual in this way or that way? And that we never get around to actually doing meditation. We never get around to addressing our personal issues, and we never get around to enlightenment. So that's why it's very important before we actually engage in Vajrayana practice and all this sort of the whole distracting, you could say, dimension of the wealth that actually is about seeing reality in terms of its purity, in terms of deity and mandala. Before we do that, there first has to be an actual experience of purity in terms of our own mind. There has to be already a clarity and a confidence in terms of the deity within, in terms of the Buddha within, in terms of wisdom within. And it's on the basis of that that we can begin to understand how the phenomenal world also possesses an innate purity. So the practice of meditation is absolutely indispensable right from the word go in the path to enlightenment and in the Buddhist practice. And that's where what we do when we sit, which is then what we call shamatha, calm abiding, is actually provide a framework where we could be physically grounded, physically still, and on the basis of that, then also establish a grounding psychologically, where we're not just tagging along with whatever psychological impulse comes up, and where we could actually be free from our fixation on the thoughts that arise. And this is where there's a huge difference between the theory and the practice. That's why the practice of meditation is absolutely indispensable. Without that, then the whole Buddhist project of enlightenment and you could say ethical behavior, compassionate behavior, it could just become behaviorism. It could just become moralistic prescriptions. And we could end up thinking, well, as a good Buddhist, I should behave in a particular way. But that's absolute rubbish. These behaviors and so on, they should come from within on the basis of spontaneous qualities that are developed through the mind finding its natural peace. Of course, to some extent, the ethical behavior and so on have a sort of a yogic quality of aligning ourselves with particular behavior, enables us to connect with, you could say, this disposition that naturally is part of us. But without really having some sense of the non-aggression and the peace that is the practice of calm abiding, then these things will really just be, you could say, ideals, and we will just be operating with trying to be in a particular way. So we need to do ourselves the favor of actually allowing ourselves to breathe, to connect, to find peace from within, and not just behave peacefully. It's not going to help that we sort of dress in white and we sort of speak softly and we sort of have a whole our whole house is full of Asian decor, and we're sort of sympathetic to, you could say, the Tibetan cause or the spiritual cause or the cosmic cause or whatever it might be. You know, there has to really be something that is completely genuine, and from that point of view, it doesn't really matter what we look like exterior. So that's where the practice of meditation is indispensable. The practice of shamatha is the practice of allowing ourselves to be present, and it is the practice of non-distraction. And we effectively achieve that through focus. We have an object of focus, and this is then what we sometimes refer to as the object of mindfulness. When we practice meditation, we disengage from the ordinary distracted condition of tagging along with our thinking, all our memories, all the thoughts that we have and that drive us, and our opinions and attitudes and so on, the afflicted states of mind. It's actually taking us out of our heads. It's, despite what meditation looks like, it's actually not being caught in thought. It's actually not being just wound up in our psychology. It's actually being free of our psychology. And that's where we need to have something that we refer to that's not tangled up within our thinking. And that's where we need either an external object, or we have something as immediate as our breath. But the moment that we begin to train in just being present with our breath, we actually begin to shift our focus from being distracted and carried away by absorbed by our thoughts into actually being present and free from our thoughts. It doesn't mean we stop the thoughts, but it's on the basis of this awareness or focus that we actually begin to have some psychological calm. So that's where it helps us to have this simplicity that comes from just focusing on the breath. The instruction that I normally present here has to do with taking a posture, which is then sitting on a chair or sitting on the ground, where we can actually sit comfortably, and particularly where we can keep our spine straight. If you are sitting on the ground, then it helps maybe to have a cushion under yourself, but mainly so we want to have the spine straight, and actually also with the basis of having a spine straight, also relaxing the shoulders, relaxing our whole body, and actually having a comfortable place, but also where we sit straight and are not slouching. So we would say there are some aspects of our posture which involve having the straight spine, the shoulders back. We'd say we take the chin in a little bit, we lower the gaze. We don't need to close the eyes, but just lowering the gaze. Hands on the knees or in the lap, whichever is more convenient. And then relaxing the jaw. If we need to, we can leave a bit of space between the lips so we can breathe through our mouth if we need to. So that's the posture. The second aspect, that has to do with where we focus, and that is essentially focusing on the breath as the object of mindfulness. And in this particular instruction, we actually focus more on the out-breath, because it's the out-breath that actually takes us out of ourselves. So while we, of course, if we like to focus on the in-breath, that's fine, but there's a particular advantage with actually emphasizing the out-breath and then simply just allowing for a gap in our attention when we breathe in. And again, particularly focusing on the out-breath. So that's where we then place our attention. So when we're meditating, we don't really need to be sitting waiting for something to happen. What will happen will happen. But what we're actually doing, we are actually proactive when we're meditating. We're actually doing something. We're focusing on something. Just like if you're cutting carrots, you want to focus on cutting the carrots. Otherwise, you might slice your finger. So you focus on doing something. So we're not as when we're slicing carrots, we're not waiting for something particular to happen, actually. We're just focused. We're realizing the value of remaining focused. So when we're meditating, we are not waiting for some particular state of mind to sort of descend on us. We're focusing on the out-breath. That's what we're doing. If somebody comes up and sort of says, "What are you doing?" I'm just saying, "I'm watching my breath." Simple as that. We don't even need to call it meditation or something special. I am just sitting still and watching my breath. Simple as that. If somebody asks you, "What do you do when you meditate?" You just say, "I sit and watch my breath." Don't need to embellish it with saying, "I'm going into a particular state" or whatever. You're not. And if you're going into that state, I'm sorry, it's going to pass anyway. So don't get attached to it. So the breath is where we come back to. But the third aspect then of meditation technique is the relationship to our psychology. And that is all the thoughts that arise. And that's where thoughts will arise, the memories will arise, impulses and perceptions and so on will constantly be there. There will be perceptions happening all the time, and there'll be thoughts. And so this is where when we're meditating, we do something radically different from what we ordinarily do, is that rather than be absorbed by these thoughts as they arise, these memories or thoughts, I need to do this, I need to remember that. While we're meditating, there is a certain, you could say, boundary that we set. We actually don't follow after the thoughts. Doesn't mean that we're demonizing or marginalizing thoughts in any way, but it just means while we're meditating, we actually are allowing ourselves to get a wider perspective or a greater relationship to the thoughts, which is not about allowing the thoughts to drive us or to control us. So that's where, as we're meditating, we're going to have the same old thoughts. We're not going to go into some particular state where there are no thoughts, but rather we are going to have thoughts, but what we're doing here is simply just be aware of them and then come back to the breath. So we're remaining undistracted, and that is the real function of shamatha or calm abiding, is that we're sustaining non-distraction on the basis of having this breath that we come back to. So we're not going to have any particular practice of fixating or sustaining a state of mind. But what we are doing is training ourselves in, as we're sitting, to not be carried away and absorbed by the thoughts. Of course, we can do that afterwards, and we need to think about taxes, and we need to think about all the things that we ordinarily need to engage with. But while we're meditating, this is a place where we train in something that's uncommon and what we normally not do, which is not be absorbed by the thoughts. And that's where, when we train in that, we begin to have some freedom from the ordinary grip that the thoughts normally impose on us. So that's where we begin to have some wider perspective. And it's interestingly also where we begin to come out of our heads. And it's interestingly there where it actually paves the way for us being more participating in the world. It means that we begin to become more aware of the other. And it's also from there we begin to have the qualities such as compassion, being less caught up in this circle around ourself. Then there's also greater awareness of what's happening with the others and the ability to see things from others' perspective. So the practice of meditation comes with both a quality of insight and also a quality of compassion. So we would say these two qualities, wisdom and compassion, really signify the project of the path, or the project of meditation. And it's also this which then spills into post-meditation, our engagement with the world. So this is really the core of meditation. Now, one thing that we do in all the various Buddhist traditions is that we precede meditation with something that sets a particular atmosphere. And so in the particular context here, we'll be reciting a short text that invokes the presence of the Buddha. And you could say, just like you invoke the presence of anybody, their presence actually has sort of a sense of influencing the atmosphere. So so invoking the presence of the Buddha invokes a particular greatness and a particular sense of something sacred. And this also contributes to us going beyond the ordinary fixations of the mind, the ordinary limitations and the ordinary narratives of the mind. So simply just thinking that we're present with the Buddha, we engage with the practice of visualizing the Buddha, and also there's this verbalizing the relationship to the Buddha through this sort of, you could say, poetry of bhakti, and the chanting the qualities of the Buddha. So this, of course, is practiced universally all across the various Buddhist traditions preceding meditation. And what we have here is a short liturgy by a sage called Jamgon, who was my teacher's teacher. And on the basis of his own vision of the Buddha, then Jamgon wrote this short liturgy. So we'll chant that, and we'll first visualize the Buddha, then there's some devotional chants to the Buddha, and then chanting some what we call dharani or mantra a little bit. Then we dissolve the reference to the Buddha as external, and then we settle into meditation. And we'll simply just do 15 minutes of meditation. I think next time we'll begin then the practice that I've been promising, but going back to what we normally would do, which is 20 minutes of sitting, and then 10 minutes of mindful walking, and then 20 minutes of sitting after that. So we'll start next week doing that. So we'll need to do a little bit of organizing here before we do that, but we'll do that from next week. Yeah. So if you have your liturgy, I'll just bring it up on the screen here. I apologize, we don't have any tables, so so you can put your text on the plastic cover there, so you're not putting it straight on the ground. One day we'll invent the table, but for the time being we don't have it. So the first part is taking the refuge and developing the enlightened attitude. We'll chant that 3 times, and then the rest we'll simply read through. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lion throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth, touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him, and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own, others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray, with total confidence and faith, do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha. To you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yatao muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 O 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 muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 Om Mani Mani Maha Munaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. Okay, so we go to the the aspiration prayer of Maitreya. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the world in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhamma Dhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of the self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure. With an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion, like through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in the bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramita, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed, never to depart from the teachings. Akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadurgani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadurgani nignata. Tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadurgani nignata. Tavam mama stiti bhuya jagadurgani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you. And